There are places in the Oregon mountains where the forest grows so dense that daylight struggles to reach the ground. Pines stand shoulder to shoulder like silent witnesses. Trails disappear without warning. Sound behaves differently there. Footsteps feel swallowed, voices travel strangely, and at night, the wind doesn't howl, it whispers. Search and rescue teams who've worked those mountains say the same thing. People don't just get lost there. They vanish. And in the fall of 2018, two newlyweds walked into that wilderness believing they were stepping into the beginning of a beautiful life together, unaware that they were walking into a mystery that would haunt investigators, families, and the internet for years to come. If you're coming across this channel for the first time and you're drawn to real stories that don't have easy answers, stories that unfold slowly and leave you questioning everything, please subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next story. Now let's begin from the very day everything started. Their names were Caleb Wright and Emily Harper. They were both in their mid-20s. Caleb was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and known for his calm presence. Emily was curious, energetic, and endlessly romantic. They met during college, bonded over road trips and hiking weekends, and shared a deep love for nature. Not the casual kind, but the type that makes you feel small in a comforting way. Friends said the mountains felt like home to them. So when they married in late summer, instead of choosing a beach resort or luxury hotel, they made a different decision. They chose the Oregon mountains. Not as a honeymoon getaway, but as an exploration trip. A reset. A symbolic beginning. They wanted quiet. They wanted trees instead of crowds. They wanted mornings wrapped in fog and nights under unfamiliar stars. They wanted to feel untouched by the noise of the world. And for the first few days, they did. Their last confirmed sighting came from a small mountain supply store on the edge of a national forest. Security footage showed them smiling, holding hands, browsing maps and trail snacks. Emily wore a light jacket, her hair tied loosely behind her head. Caleb carried most of the gear, joking with the cashier as he paid. They didn't look nervous. They didn't look rushed. They didn't look like people who were about to disappear. They told the cashier they planned to explore a less-traveled trail system. Nothing extreme, nothing dangerous. Just nature. Just time together. That was the last time anyone outside the mountains ever saw them alive. For the next 2 days, their phones sent brief signals, weak pings that suggested movement deeper into the forest. Then, suddenly, silence. No calls. No texts. No GPS updates. At first, their families weren't alarmed. Caleb and Emily were known for disconnecting. They believed in unplugging. But by day 4, concern turned into dread. By day 6, search and rescue was notified. What followed was one of the largest missing person searches that region had seen in years. Helicopters scanned from above. Volunteers walked miles of rugged terrain. Dogs tracked scents that seemed to vanish mid-trail. Investigators found their vehicle parked exactly where it should have been, untouched, locked, no signs of struggle. Inside were items no experienced hiker would willingly leave behind. Spare water, extra food, emergency flares. The trailhead log showed their names neatly written. Everything suggested they had entered the forest. But nothing suggested they had ever left it. As days turned into weeks, the search area expanded. Creeks were drained. Abandoned cabins were checked. Old campsites were unearthed. Nothing. No blood. No torn clothing. No footprints leading off a cliff or into water. Just absence. And absence, investigators say, can be more terrifying than evidence. Whispers began spreading among volunteers. Some claimed to feel watched while searching. Others reported hearing distant sounds, footsteps where no one stood. Officials dismissed it as exhaustion and fear. But the families weren't comforted. Caleb's mother insisted something was wrong from the start. Emily's sister said the silence didn't feel accidental. Both families agreed on one thing: the mountains didn't just take them. Someone, somewhere, knew something. Weeks passed. Then months. The official narrative slowly shifted from active search to presumed accident. Resources were pulled. Media attention faded. The forest, as it always does, reclaimed the story. Until 10 months later, a hunter, miles from the original search zone, noticed something strange near a ravine, an unnatural flash of color against the brown forest floor. Blue. At first, he thought it was trash. But as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't just one object. It was a bag. And then another. Both were blue. Both were heavy. Both were stuffed full of something that didn't belong in the wilderness. Feathers. Not scattered. Not loose. Packed. The discovery would reopen the case and introduce questions that still don't have answers. But before we go there, before we talk about what was inside those bags, we need to rewind. Because the truth is, Caleb and Emily's disappearance wasn't as quiet as it first appeared. There were signs. Small ones. Easy to miss. And someone, at some point, crossed their path in those mountains. In the weeks after Caleb Wright and Emily Harper vanished, investigators insisted the case was straightforward. 2 inexperienced hikers. Challenging terrain. Unpredictable weather. A tragic accident. But behind closed doors, the people closest to the search knew that explanation didn't sit right. Because the deeper they looked, the more the timeline began to bend, and certain details refused to stay buried. The first red flag came from distance. Caleb and Emily's planned route was conservative. Their map, recovered from the car, showed a loop trail designed for day hikers, not something that would normally pull a couple miles off course. Search teams scoured that loop repeatedly. Nothing. No signs of injury. No broken branches. No disturbed soil. It was as if the Newlyweds had stepped off the trail and evaporated. Then came the phone data. While their phones went dark after 2 days, technicians managed to extract partial location information. The ping suggested movement away from the loop, not deeper along it, and not in a straight line. They zigzagged. That pattern bothered search coordinators. Lost hikers tend to wander randomly, often circling. But Caleb and Emily's movement showed brief stops, long pauses, then sudden direction changes. Almost like they were following something. Or someone. Investigators initially kept this quiet, worried it would spark panic or conspiracy theories. But word spread among volunteers, and fear followed. Then came the witness statements. A week into the search, a backpacker contacted authorities claiming he'd seen a couple matching Caleb and Emily's description 3 days after their disappearance. He said they looked tense. The woman, white, mid-20s, kept glancing behind her. The man, black, tall, quiet, had his hand tightly clenched around a strap on his pack. The backpacker said he'd passed them near an unofficial trail that didn't appear on most maps. When asked why he didn't stop or report it sooner, he said something chilling. "I thought they were trying not to be noticed." The problem? Search records showed that area hadn't been cleared until 2 weeks later. Meaning if the sighting was real, Caleb and Emily were alive longer than anyone believed. And they weren't just lost. They were moving. Another overlooked detail came from the supply store cashier, the last person to officially see them. After the case gained media attention, she called investigators back with something she hadn't mentioned before. She remembered a third person. A man standing near the maps. At the time, she thought nothing of it. The store served hikers constantly. But once she saw Caleb and Emily's faces everywhere, the memory sharpened. The man hadn't spoken to them, at least not directly. But he lingered, watched, left shortly after they did. She couldn't describe his face clearly, just his posture, still, patient, and the fact that he exited without buying anything. Investigators canvassed nearby campgrounds. Rangers questioned locals. Nothing definitive surfaced. But the idea that Caleb and Emily weren't alone that day took hold. Then the search dogs found something else. Near a creek about 4 miles from the trailhead, tracking dogs hit a scent, strong, sudden, unmistakable. And then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Handlers described it as lifted. As if the trail had been carried beyond that point. No drag marks. No blood. No evidence of a fall. Just a scent ending where it shouldn't. Search teams quietly expanded the perimeter again. They checked old Forest Service roads, some abandoned, some barely visible beneath years of debris. On one of those roads, tire impressions were discovered. Not fresh enough to cast, but recent enough to notice. Officials debated whether to include this in the report. In the end, they listed it as inconclusive. Families weren't satisfied. Caleb's brother pushed back publicly, saying the narrative of an accident ignored too many unanswered questions. Emily's parents hired a private investigator, hoping an outsider might see what others missed. The PI noticed something subtle but disturbing. Nothing belonging to Caleb or Emily was ever found alone. No dropped glove. No water bottle. No scraps of clothing. In wilderness disappearances, items usually surface, torn by terrain, scattered by animals. Here, there was nothing. Almost like someone had cleaned the scene. As months passed, the case cooled. Leads dried up. The forest settled back into silence. Until winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. And then, 10 months after the Newlyweds vanished, the call came in. A hunter. An off-route ravine. 2 blue bags. When deputies arrived, they noticed the same thing the hunter did. The bags weren't hidden. They were placed. Balanced carefully between rocks. Not buried. Not tossed. And they were filled with feathers, packed so tightly they spilled out when one bag shifted. Feathers from multiple birds. Different sizes. Different colors. No one could explain why. As forensic teams prepared to open the bags, one officer reportedly muttered something under his breath. This wasn't nature. And just before the contents were revealed, investigators realized something else, something that would change how they viewed the entire case. The bags were nowhere near where Caleb and Emily were last believed to be, which meant someone had moved them. When investigators finally opened the blue bags in the evidence tent, the forest around them felt unnaturally quiet. No wind. No birds. Just the sound of latex gloves stretching tight and the slow unzip of heavy fabric. The feathers came first. They were everywhere, packed so tightly they resisted being moved, as if deliberately compressed. Some were long and dark, others pale and brittle. Experts later identified them as coming from multiple species, none of which naturally molted in large quantities in that region at the same time of year. This wasn't a nest. This wasn't natural decay. It was intentional. And beneath the feathers were human remains. The scene froze everyone in place. The remains were separated, 1 bag for Caleb, 1 for Emily. That much was immediately clear. What wasn't clear was why they had been treated this way. There were no identifying documents inside the bags. No wallets. No phones. No jewelry. Just remains, wrapped, padded, hidden beneath layers of feathers. Almost like insulation. Almost like preservation. Forensic examiners worked carefully, knowing the public would eventually hear about this, and knowing that once they did, the questions would explode. The preliminary findings ruled out animal attack. There were no signs consistent with predation. No scattering. No gnaw marks in the way wildlife typically leaves behind. Instead, the remains showed post-mortem handling. Movement. Placement. The feathers complicated everything. They interfered with decomposition patterns. They altered moisture levels. They masked scent, something investigators now believed was done deliberately to prevent search dogs from detecting the bodies sooner. Which raised a terrifying possibility. Whoever did this understood how searches worked. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. No obvious fatal injuries could be conclusively identified due to environmental exposure and time. But that didn't mean there was no violence. It meant it had been hidden well. As news broke, public attention snapped back to the case. Headlines focused on the bags, the feathers, the eerie presentation. Online forums erupted with speculation, ritualistic theories, symbolism, warnings. Authorities dismissed the more extreme ideas, but privately, even seasoned detectives admitted the setup felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The families were notified separately. Emily's mother reportedly collapsed upon hearing the details. Caleb's father asked only one question. Did they suffer? No one could give him a real answer. As investigators reviewed the entire timeline again, something unsettling emerged. The location where the bags were found had been searched, loosely, months earlier. Not thoroughly, but enough that 2 large blue bags should have been noticed. Which meant one of 2 things. They were missed, or they weren't there yet. This realization reframed everything. Someone may have returned to the forest. Someone may have waited. Detectives quietly reviewed ranger logs, volunteer lists, and civilian access records. Dozens of people had been in and out of the area over 10 months. Hunters, hikers, seasonal workers. No clear suspect emerged. But patterns began to surface. The feathers were traced back to a local poultry processing facility, not conclusively, but enough to narrow sourcing. Someone with access. Someone local, or at least familiar with the region. Then there was the blue bags themselves. Industrial grade. Weather-resistant. Not something you casually hike with. And not something that degrades easily. Someone had planned this. As the case grew colder again, one final detail surfaced, a detail that never made it into early press releases. A volunteer searcher came forward months later, shaken and hesitant. He claimed that during the original search, he'd seen blue material through trees near a ravine, but assumed it was a tarp or abandoned gear. He never reported it. He didn't want to seem foolish. The ravine matched the recovery site. By the time authorities followed up, it was too late to confirm whether the bags had been there all along, or placed later. That uncertainty became the case's shadow. Years later, no arrests have been made. No suspects publicly named. Just a theory that refuses to fade. That Caleb and Emily encountered someone in those mountains. Someone who watched. Someone who waited. Someone who knew the land well enough to erase evidence, and patient enough to return when no one was looking. By the time Caleb Wright and Emily Harper were laid to rest, the Oregon mountains had already swallowed the last traces of the investigation. The search tents were gone. The caution tape had been pulled down. And the ravine where the blue bags were found looked exactly as it had before, untouched, indifferent. Nature, as always, moved on. But for the people left behind, the case never did. In the months following the discovery, detectives revisited every lead with new urgency, driven by one haunting realization. This wasn't a disappearance, it was a concealment. Someone had taken time. Someone had returned. And someone had felt confident enough to leave the remains where they would eventually be found. Yet despite the renewed attention, the case refused to break open. No usable DNA surfaced that didn't belong to Caleb or Emily. No fingerprints were recovered from the blue bags. No security cameras existed deep enough in the forest to track movement. Even cell tower data proved useless, too sparse, too fragmented. It was as if the person responsible had planned the crime in a place where modern investigation simply failed. Families pushed for answers. Emily's sister publicly questioned why the possibility of human involvement wasn't emphasized sooner. Caleb's family requested federal assistance, believing the case crossed into something more deliberate than local authorities could handle. But without a suspect, without a weapon, without a definitive cause of death, there was nowhere for the case to go. So investigators turned to theory. One idea suggested the couple encountered someone living off-grid, someone who didn't want to be seen. Another proposed they crossed paths with a transient individual familiar with Forest Service roads and search patterns. And then there was the theory no one liked to say out loud, that the person who did this may have participated in the search. It wasn't unheard of. History had proven that killers sometimes insert themselves into investigations, to monitor progress, to blend in, to feel in control. Volunteer lists were reviewed again. Nothing definitive emerged. But the possibility lingered, poisoning every memory of well-meaning help. Then there were the feathers. Despite analysis, no clear explanation was ever accepted. Officials described them as anomalous, a word that satisfied paperwork but answered nothing. To the families, the feathers felt like a signature. Not random, not practical, but symbolic. A way to confuse, a way to delay, a way to make sure the truth stayed buried just a little longer. Years later, hikers still report strange feelings in that region of the forest, an oppressive quiet, a sense of being observed. Rangers dismiss it as imagination, but they also quietly advise people to stay on marked trails. Because some trails don't lead back. The case of Caleb and Emily remains officially unsolved. No suspects, no arrests, no closure. Just a young black man and a young white woman who went into the mountains to celebrate love, and were returned to the world in silence, wrapped in blue bags filled with feathers. If you believe this was more than an accident, you're not alone. And if you think someone out there knows exactly what happened that day, someone who walks free, blending into ordinary life, then the story isn't really over. It's just waiting. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more deep-dive true crime cases that refuse to give easy answers. Like this video to help it reach more people, share it with someone who questions official narratives, and comment below with your theory. Accident, encounter, or something far darker. Because sometimes, the most frightening part of a mystery isn't the ending. It's the silence that follows.